Again, Andy Hopper, Senior Solutions Architect here at AWS, and I help customers understand how to take their applications, move them into AWS, and optimize their costs when they're doing so. And frequently when you're talking about moving applications into AWS, one of the questions that you're going to be having is, of course, on top of all the infrastructure necessary to run your applications, you also are going to have questions around what you do with your data. Oftentimes, companies invest a lot of time and effort. They've built a significant presence in a database platform, and that's not restricted to just Microsoft and Oracle, although that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But they'll have a commercial database engine they're running on premise, and now they're trying to understand, how am I going to continue to leverage this while I'm engaged in this process of moving to the cloud and really starting to become an innovative, and have that culture of innovation with my own company. In addition, a lot of companies, especially large enterprises, have a deep investment in using SAP as their ERP of choice. And what we'll actually be talking about in this deck is I'm going to break this into two major sections. So we'll talk about the process of moving like your traditional relational engines like Microsoft, Oracle, SQL Server over into AWS. We'll talk about what your options are, about how you can do things like run those database engines on our virtual machine platform. We call it Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2. We'll talk about what your options are for how you can take those databases and move them over into AWS. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about taking advantage of the cloud. We actually have managed services that can help you lower your overhead so you can start focusing on the things that actually make your company special. And then in closing on the database side, I just wanted to at least whisper in your ear a little bit about taking advantage of moving to the cloud. In AWS, you're not just restricted to the database platform that you're using when you're in your on-premises world. You actually have a wealth of services at your fingertips. And so we're seeing a lot of companies that actually start to leverage the capabilities that the cloud offers by using the right tool for the job. Now, the second half of the talk, I just wanted to dig in a bit on SAP. SAP is, it's a different workload than your traditional database is. And so I wanted to really cover, why would you be interested in moving your SAP presence to AWS in the first place? What are the benefits of doing that? And then I wanted to talk a bit about, what it looks like to take something which a lot of companies consider to be a mission critical workload and safely move that over to AWS and also reap all the benefits that AWS has, the experience that we have, as well as all the TCO benefits, the total cost of ownership benefits you see by operating a workload like that in the cloud. So let's talk a little bit about the relational database engines. When people are look to take an existing database engine and move it over into AWS, we've got a term for that. We call it lift and shift, because effectively what you're doing is you're taking the exact same workload that you've got and you're just changing the location it's currently running. The advantage of something like this is that, for your DBAs, it's the exact same experience that they have when they're running it on a box that you've got in your own data center, right? They use the exact same set of management tools. They can, interact with the operating system underneath the database platform. And so they feel warm and fuzzy because it's something that they already know. In addition, by virtue of the fact that EC2 is a virtual machine platform, you have complete control over the database engine. I mean, you're installing the database software on there, and you get access to all the lower level bits that you have when you're running it on your own on-premises machines. And one of the advantages to something like this is, if you have existing perpetual licenses for software, like for Oracle or for SQL Server, and you'd like to continue to leverage those, you can actually leverage, EC2 as your platform. Again, all you're doing is changing the location that it's running. You can then just apply your licenses to its new home inside AWS. Now, all this, awesome access to all the features and whatnot, that does come with a little bit of a dark side, right? So if you're installing the database engine and you're running it on an operating system, well, you've still got all of the administrative tasks that come with the care and feeding of that database engine. You've got to make sure your database engine is still got all of its point releases installed. You've got to have, all the patches, for that database engine, just to make sure that you're not encountering any bugs. In addition, you've got to take care of the underlying operating system. Patch Tuesday is still a thing, so Microsoft releases patches. You want to make sure that you're not opening yourself up to 0 days, so you've got to keep the underlying OS patched as well. And on top of that, you've also got the hardware. So, just because you're running in the cloud doesn't mean you're magically, obviated from all the things that happen in the physical world. And our CTO is actually famous for saying that everything fails all the time, and it's absolutely true. Anybody who tells you differently is actually just lying to you. Hard drives die, CPUs go on the flake, and you just have to make sure you're planning for that sort of thing when you're operating it on any VM platform, and that's regardless of what cloud provider you're using. Now, while we're talking about moving into EC2, I did want to point out there are 2 modes that you can run database engines on EC2. There's something called default tenancy, and then there's something called dedicated hosts. So with default tenancy, this is actually the one that most everybody's already familiar with. If you go into the EC2 console and you spin up a new VM under EC2, you're actually using the default tenancy option. What's going on is you're picking the operating system you're going to run on the box. You pick the size and all that, and then we, AWS, take care of finding a home for the VM. You've said you want X number of CPUs, this amount of RAM. We'll find a location that's got the available capacity for that, and then we'll start running it on that available host. In addition, with default tenancy, you get to take advantage of Amazon's, our web services now famous pay-as-you-go model. So if you crank up a default tenancy box and you run it for 5 minutes, for 15 minutes, whatever, you're only paying for the amount of time you're actually using that amount of CPU and RAM capacity on the machine. Now, on the other hand, we've got dedicated hosts. And the primary reason that people tend to gravitate towards dedicated hosts is that sometimes you may have a license in hand that says that thou shalt run this software on a box that's 100% dedicated to you. And so what people will do is they allocate a dedicated host, and when you allocate a dedicated host, you're effectively getting an entire server out of a rack of servers that we've got in one of our facilities. And by virtue of that, you now have access to all of the capacity. You get to determine where you want to run your VMs. If you have more than one dedicated host, you simply just determine where you'd like for this EC2 instance to run on those dedicated hosts. But unlike with the default tenancy, where you're only paying for the CPU and RAM capacity that you're running for that duration of time, you're paying for the entire host. So regardless of how many EC2 instances or how few EC2 instances you're running on that host, you're saying, hey, I want to allocate this amount of horsepower. And depending upon the type of machine you allocate, it could be anywhere from 16 vCPUs all the way up to like 224. It does depend on the instance type of dedicated host you use. However, again, the advantage here is if you have a significant investment in your own licenses and you want to be able to apply them in the cloud, under certain circumstances, dedicated hosts are the only game in town so that you can continue to leverage those while you're running inside EC2. Now, while we're talking about licensing, I did want to mention something else. So Amazon also offers something called license included Amazon machine images. You may hear us refer to them as AMIs, AMIs. What these are virtual machine instance images where we've installed the operating system, we've also installed the database engine, and most importantly, we're taking care of all the licensing that comes with the database engine. So what this means for you is that you're no longer having to keep track of the operating system and or database engine licenses that you're consuming. So this means that with your relationship with your vendor of choice, whether that's Oracle or Microsoft, there is no longer these conversations where you have to actually count, you check out all of the boxes that you're actually running their software on. There is no such thing as a true up anymore because Amazon is actually managing all the bookkeeping for you to run that software on EC2. And with all this, it also means, again, you get access to the same pay-as-you-go model that you do with EC2. So this is awesome if you have a transient workload. Let's say you've got a SQL database server that you have a small project, you're only going to run that project for about a month. Well, in the old on-premises world, you had to make sure you had that SQL Server license, period. Even if you're only going to run it for a month, you still had to go buy it. With license included on EC2, you run that EC2 instance for the duration of that month. As soon as the project's over, you spin it down, you stop paying for the license. Now, in addition to all this is if you want to, say, upgrade your licenses. Again, in the on-premises world, let's say I've got SQL Server 2014 and I want to upgrade to 2019. I now have to go and buy new licenses for SQL 2019, and then I go through the migration process. I make a backup and restore and all that. In EC2, it literally is easy as make a backup of your existing 2014 box, you spin it down, you spin up a new 2019 box, you restore from backup, and you're done. There's no new license to be acquired. You don't have to worry about any changes to your enterprise agreements, anything like that. It's all being taken care of by AWS. Now, the nice thing about the machine included images, or the license included images, is that not only do they work on default tenancy, but we just recently announced that you could run them on dedicated hosts as well. So if you've got, like, say, a hybrid model, let's say you do have a few perpetual licenses on hand that you want to apply to dedicated hosts, but you still have excess capacity left over, you can actually leverage the dedicated host platform, run license included images on those. The incremental cost of the licenses are what you're paying for, and you still get to leverage the fact that you've already made an investment in the hardware that workload's running on. So it's a great way to continue to optimize your costs. And by the way, we have teams of guys who are willing to stand by and who are willing to talk to you about the licensing discussion. It's a very complex discussion, and I can't do it justice in just 30 minutes worth of time. But please, my contact information is here on this deck. Do reach out to me, and I'll make sure I route you to the right guy if you're interested in having that kind of conversation. Now, all this being said, let's talk about the actual process of moving your database workloads into AWS. It's relatively straightforward. It's not rocket surgery, right? You're going to create a VM to run your database engine. You will, of course, determine, based on the licensing model that you're under, are you going to use the dedicated host? Are you going to use the license included AMI? Then you pick the size of box you're going to launch your database workload on. You pick the number of virtual CPUs, the amount of RAM, the size of the storage volumes you're going to attach to the box, and then you pick the AMI, whether that's the license included AMI we provide or an AMI that you create where you install the database engine software from your own installation media. Either way, once you've got the operating system image in place, you then launch your instance, and then the only thing that's left is just moving the data from point A to point B. So let's talk a little bit about what the process of moving your data is going to look like. And actually, first, I'm just going to go right down the middle here. So I wanted to underscore, EC2 is a virtual machine platform. If you're running a database engine on it, the exact same tools that you know and love today will continue to work with EC2. So case in point, if you want to use Oracle's Enterprise Manager to make a backup and restore your database on your box that you're running in EC2, fine, you can totally do that. Same thing with SQL Server. You can use SQL Server Management Studio to backup and restore. You can even use SSMS's ability to copy data between two database servers and migrate your data that way. However, what I wanted to talk about a little bit is on the left-hand side of the diagram here. We've got a couple of other services that we offer to you folks. The first is Database Migration Services, or DMS. Its purpose in life is to move data. And it can move data from between two machines. It can move data between two versions of database engines. It can also move data between two different engines from one another. Now, with that last one, you might be scratching your head and saying, well, wait a minute, if I've got my schema in SQL Server, how on earth can it move my data into, say, MySQL or Postgres or something like that? Well, the answer is the other column that's right next to it. We have something called the schema conversion tool. And just as the database migration services job is to move data from point A to point B, the schema conversion tool's job is to move schemas from point A to point B. Obviously, you can use it to just copy your DDL from a SQL Server box to another of the same edition. You can also use it to do version-to-version upgrades. So again, that canonical 2014 to 2019, you can use Schema Conversion Tool to verify that all of the DDL that you've got in your older database is still going to continue to function under that newer engine. But the thing that a lot of people use Schema Conversion Tool for is when they are looking at the possibility of maybe even changing database engine. So case in point, if you're running under a commercial engine like Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle, you're on the hook for licensing, whether it's you're using the license included machine images, or it's the licenses that you've already acquired from your vendor. There are open source database alternatives out there that are actually really good and really cost effective. And so what a lot of customers are doing is they'll take the Schema Conversion Tool, they'll point it at their existing, say, SQL Server database, then they'll point the target at a MySQL database, and what the Schema Conversion Tool will do is actually take all the tables, indexes, stored procedures, what have you, from your original database and actually generate a schema that's compatible with your target database engine. And in many cases, it can do that without any human involvement whatsoever. Obviously, there got to be cases where perhaps you're using something that's a really esoteric feature of the database engine, or maybe it's something that's present only on that database engine, in which case what the Schema Conversion Tool will actually do is tell you, hey, I've identified something to where there's going to have to be a little bit of engineering effort in order for you to be able to switch platforms. But if you're just doing just standard SQL stuff, tables, indexes, store procedures, the Schema Conversion Tool can get you almost all the way towards that migration without you having to invest any engineering effort whatsoever. Now, on the right side of this diagram, I just wanted to pay a bit of attention to the other alternatives, right? So case in point, if we're talking about the possibility of moving to different database engines, there are a bunch of open source projects out there just for that. Case in point, Aura 2PG, let's say you wanted to move Oracle databases to Postgres, you could use DMS and SET to do that, or you could use the Aura 2PG open source project for it. The advantage of projects like these is that they're purpose-built. They're done for a particular type of scenario, and so they're very well tuned for doing something like that. However, the other thing I just wanted to point out is there are also commercial alternatives for a lot of these things. Let's say, for example, you're running on Oracle, and Oracle's got their own database data migration tool. It's called Golden Gate. Again, just like you can use the native tooling for your database engine to manage your databases in AWS, you can use those same commercial tools to do data migration, transformation, failover, all that kind of thing that you're already used to in your on-premises world. So while we're talking about the possibility of running your databases on AWS, I do want to at least talk to you a little bit about what other capabilities you're able to access by virtue of running in the cloud. So let's talk a little bit about the premise of running the database engine yourself on EC2. When you're doing that, like I said earlier, you're on the hook for the care and feeding of these boxes. This means that you have to make sure the software is properly configured on the machine. You have to make sure that everything's properly patched up. You have to maintain backups of both the operating system and the database. You have to curate your backup retention. And on top of that, you have to be paying attention, or at least have a remediation plan for what happens if a piece of hardware fails. Do you have it set up as a hot configuration where things can fail over in the event that something were to go on the fritz? Do you have a good backup and restore recovery plan in the event where you just want to have a single one and do backup restore? But it's all on you to actually maintain that. In addition, you have to make sure that you've got adequate CPU and RAM allocated for your databases. You've got to make sure you've allocated enough storage to run your databases, on the infrastructure that you're managing. And then finally, you are also on the hook if you've got security regimens or compliance attestations that you've got to maintain. It's on you to make sure the box is properly configured so that when it comes time for you to generate your attestations, that you're able to say, hey, look, here are the procedures we're following in order to make sure those boxes are actually maintained to the level that they need to. And this is where fully managed databases come in. We've got something called Relational Database Services, and what this is a database engine that's actually operated by AWS. And really, under the covers, all we're doing is we're spinning up the EC2 machines. We're installing the database software, but we are actually managing patching of the operating system. We're managing failover. If something were to happen to the hardware, we'll take care of resurrecting the box for you. We'll maintain automatic backups. We're taking care of hot fixes to the underlying database engine in the event that there's a security alert on it, that sort of thing. And what this allows you to do is focus on the things that actually differentiate your company from everyone else. Let's be frank. Your customers are not using your goods and services because you're really, really good at operating Oracle database engines. They're actually using you because of the data and the analytics that you put on top of that database engine. So what using managed services like relational database services allow you to do is, focus on innovating and providing the value to your customers, and frankly, just focusing on your core competency while you're letting AWS focus on our core competency, which is providing infrastructure services to you folks. Now, while we're talking about, the spectrum of things, right? So we've got the lift and shift, which is simply just move it to run on EC2, fairly straightforward process. You've also got the possibility of moving to a managed service like relational database services, where you're simply just replatforming it. But then the last alternative I wanted to mention, which I kind of hinted at earlier with schema conversion tool, is modernization. So what I find a lot of customers doing is they've got a database engine in-house. They've got SQL Server, they've got Oracle, whatever, and it becomes the only tool they have in the toolbox. And what they will frequently do is basically shoehorn certain use cases into a database engine that's not really what the database engine was designed for. Case in point, I've lost count of the number of times I've encountered customers who are leveraging SQL Server to do simple key value storage. I mean, all they're doing is just this ginormous table of customer IDs to particular values. SQL Server can definitely do it, but it's not really what SQL Server was designed for. It was designed as a relational database for managing relational integrity, that sort of thing. We happen to have a database in AWS that is ideal for name value pairs. It's called DynamoDB. And so what we're seeing a lot of customers do is realize that as they're moving into the cloud, they have access to databases that were built for specific purposes. And what they're doing is they're finding that as they're making this move, they can start slicing off the workloads that are actually better suited to running on different platforms inside AWS. We call that polyglot persistence, where you're actually using the right tool for the workload that you're running and becoming more efficient, and also lowering your costs, just because some of these tools like DynamoDB, very, very cost-effective way to store huge amounts of data without having to run a database server 24/7 just to store that small amount of data. So again, if you guys are interested in going down that path, reach out to people like me. I'm more than happy to start the conversation with you. Depending on where you are, I may find the right people in your area to talk to, since they'll be in your general area. Likewise, if you've got particular industries that you're in, I can also find you specialists for those. All right, so let's talk a bit about SAP. First, let's talk about why people are looking to move SAP into AWS. Now, I just simply don't have time to cover every single one of these bullet points here, but I'll focus on just a couple here. So, cost reduction in particular, people are finding that it's actually a very cost-effective way to operate SAP. Typically, customers who are moving SAP workloads into AWS, they're finding that they're saving anywhere from 20 to 50% of their nominal costs from operating that exact same workload inside AWS. And the reason for that is, again, in AWS, you've got advantage of the advantages of running in the cloud. So you can actually properly size your instances without worrying about the fact that you may need more later and not have a way to change the sizing of that. In the cloud, capacity and the ability to actually change the underlying size of the instance that you're running on is no longer a concern, whereas in the old on-premises days, you had to really guess at what your eventual needs are going to be, and that's what you allocated your hardware for. So for a long period of time, you're actually running well under capacity just so that you can eventually reach the capacity that you plan for. In AWS, that's no longer necessary. You identify what the size of the instances, the amount of RAM you actually need are, and you optimize for that, and you end up saving a ton of money doing that. The other thing I wanted to point out is, as you're running on SAP, you're inheriting all of the work that we here at AWS are doing to make sure our infrastructure is secure. You may have heard of something called the shared responsibility model. I'm sure someone at some point during this day has mentioned that phrase. What that effectively means is that we, AWS, will manage the security of the cloud itself. We'll make sure all the underlying host infrastructure is properly patched. We're maintaining firewalls. We're maintaining access to our facilities, all that. You get to focus on the actual care and feeding of your workload on top of that infrastructure. And so what this allows customers to do is focus on the actual layers of SAP on up that are managing their data. And so again, they're starting to be able to optimize on the things that actually matter to their business, as opposed to, you know, that Stockholm syndrome where we got really good at operating computers because we had to. Well, now you can let AWS actually engage in the management of the infrastructure, and you can start focusing on configuration, on analytics, on optimization of those workloads as they're running on top of the infrastructure that we're providing. Now, we've actually been working with SAP, for running SAP workloads on AWS for quite some time now. We've been very closely partnered with one another. And what you'll find is over time, we will continue to innovate together. As a matter of fact, SAP frequently, works with AWS to deliver cloud functionality first on our platform, just because of that long history they have with us. And you'll find that over time, we'll continue to add more and more capabilities on top of the AWS cloud in conjunction with SAP. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these again, simply because we don't have time, but we will give you PDFs of these decks later on after today. Now, what this all means for you, the customer, is that there's always something new from SAP when you're running on top of AWS. As a matter of fact, you can run almost all the SAP workloads on AWS natively using the EC2 platform. However, what I wanted to point out, all the little things you see on this deck that are orange, those are AWS only offerings. So those are things that are actually natively being hosted on the AWS platform, and you will not find them anywhere else. So again, this really speaks to that partnership, that tight partnership that we actually have with SAP. And it really speaks to the amount of trust that SAP has in the AWS platform as the correct home to run those mission critical workloads. Now, this is not a canonical list of all the customers that have migrated SAP workloads over to AWS. I mean, we have more than 5,000 customers that have now moved stuff over to AWS. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because, our CEO is actually pretty famous for saying there is no compression algorithm for experience. What this effectively means is that as we're doing this process, as we've helped customers migrate SAP over to AWS, we've learned lots of lessons about how to do it properly, about how to optimize, how to do it safely and sanely. And these are things that you only learn by doing this stuff over a long period of time. And what this means for you is that you get to inherit from all the skills that we've developed over the course of helping these customers move their workloads into AWS. And we've got customers from practically every vertical, that are using SAP, migrating their workloads into AWS. I mean, case in point, AIG, I happen to be a customer. I've got a retirement account with AIG. They moved 19 workloads into AWS over the course of about 19 months. And in the process, they found that they were actually able to operate more efficiently, and they actually saved money in the process of doing that. And again, the whole idea here is, regardless of what industry your company is in, we've probably got people who have already worked on migrations for that particular kind of industry. Because let's face it, every vertical's got their own concerns. They've got specific use cases that other verticals may not necessarily be interested in or encounter. And so for you, it means that you've got access to specialists who are able to help you and actually understand what your world looks like while they're in the process of helping you actually plan that migration from your on-premises world into AWS. Now, one thing I just wanted to point out, since I'm talking about people who can help you move, is we've actually, because we've done this so many times, we've actually developed a pretty cut and dried model for how to move SAP workloads into AWS. And it really breaks down into three major categories. We call it assess, mobilize, and migrate. And what this means is we'll have people come and talk to you. We've got a team of specialists who will actually help you, identify the salient things out of your SAP environment that need to move into AWS and how to go about doing that. We call that a discovery workshop. Simultaneously, we'll do something called a total cost of ownership, or TCO assessment. project. And that's intended to help you identify, what the cost savings are going to be by moving those workloads into AWS. Then we'll work with you to plan it. We'll build a roadmap for what it's going to look like to take those workloads, get them into AWS, what the timelines are, what the key things that need to happen along the course of that migration into AWS. And then finally, we'll mobilize a team to actually help you perform that migration. We've got our own team of specialists. We call them professional services or ProServe. You may hear us refer to them that way. However, we also have a very deep bench of partners who have been certified with SAP as one of their core competencies. And again, these folks have a lot of experience helping customers migrate SAP into AWS, and we'll get you hooked up with the right set of people to help you meet your timelines, your cost objectives, that sort of thing. In closing, the last thing I wanted to mention is, I can talk until I'm blue in the face about all the capabilities of SAP on AWS, but I'm an old software engineer. Nothing proves anything to me until I can actually get my hands on it. So we actually have something called the Launch Wizard for SAP. You go into the AWS console, you can actually crank up an SAP instance, and you can see what life in AWS is like running SAP for yourself. So you don't have to sit there and engage in long-winded conversations about it. You can actually go ahead and crank up an SAP server for yourself, see what the experience is like, and then use that as the basis for your ongoing discussions with AWS for that actual migration. So, all this being said, for both the relational engines and SAP, let's just talk about how you go about getting started. So the first thing to do is identify something that you've got in your on-premises world that you think is a good test case for moving something into AWS, and choose that as like a proof of concept. Then you would reach out to your account team. If you don't know who your account team is, reach out to me and I'll find out who your account team is. And then what they'll do is they'll come on site, they'll help you plan. We can also deliver things called immersion days where we'll educate you on the underlying technologies. It's a free engagement. We just come to today during the quarantine, we won't necessarily come to your offices, but we may engage in a video conferencing session where we're sharing decks and speaking with you. But at the end of the day, we'll make sure that you actually understand the environment that you're looking to move your workloads in. And then once you're ready to actually start the process, we'll go through that TCO evaluation process, help you understand what the financials are for making that sort of move. And then we'll do a pilot migration. We'll help you take one of those, like a real workload. And we generally do recommend that you find a production workload as your real pilot. Frequently, if you choose like just a test workload, you don't really give it short shrift. You don't pay enough attention to it. You don't allocate the right people. It's actually really important if you're going to do this sort of thing to actually commit, because it both gives you some skin in the game and it also gives you a real world test case to see what this is like. Once you complete a pilot migration and you actually get an application up and running and you see what it's like running under AWS, we often see customers then begin to actually plan migration of the remainder of their workloads. I've actually got a customer who just completed a pilot migration of an application, and they had such a good experience that they're now looking to migrate the remainder of their fleet of applications. They have something like 190 apps that are running on Windows, and now they're ready to pull the trigger and move into AWS. But they were only able to do that by virtue of the fact that they took a reasonably complex application that hit just enough for them to say that, yes, this gives us a level of confidence that this thing is actually going to run properly inside AWS. And then once they migrated other databases over, they moved all their machines over, then they felt confident enough that it was time to go ahead and start the overall conversation. I also wanted to include just a few helpful resources about some of the things I was talking about. So again, don't take my word for it on RDS. We've got several case studies from many verticals. If you go to that RDS customers link, you can see case studies and attestations from customers who are talking about how they're running their workloads on top of a relational database services platform. In addition, I didn't mention this earlier, but if you are looking to move off of a commercial engine, say SQL Server or Oracle, to using an open source engine like Postgres or MySQL, we actually have a program called Database Freedom where we'll actually pay for resources to help you with the migration. We'll have a ProServe engagement where they'll actually engage in the analysis and help you convert your database schemas over into that new open source engine, and we'll help defray the costs of that sort of thing to help you out. If you're looking just migrate over general workloads, we have something called the Migration Acceleration Program. MAP also has pillars for things like SAP. So that's a fantastic way to get engaged and find out what the process is going to look like to actually take your applications and move them into AWS. And then again, just like with RDS, if you want to hear more from customers who actually have gone and done migrations into AWS, we've got a long list of case studies now of customers who've actually taken their SAP workloads, moved them to AWS, and are able to talk about what the experience was like and what the benefits are. And then lastly, I just wanted to say, for SAP in particular, we've got a team of specialists who are standing by waiting to talk to you about your SAP migration. If you just go to that link there at the bottom, it's an HTML form. You just fill out your information, and one of our sales specialists will reach out to you and help start the path of understanding what your workload looks like and how you can go through that migration. And that brings us to the end of the deck. So thank you guys very much for your time. Hopefully I didn't go over too long, but that brings us to the end.
Oh, that was great, Andy.